So as you can see, that water was thoroughly filtered by the Brita filtering system. Unfortunately, not everyone in the world has access to safe and clean drinking water. As stated by Wired, that number is 771 million people. This is a huge global issue, and one possible solution is using homemade water filters, are mostly from scraps. Now, our group actually made some of our own homemade water filters and tested them and designed them when compared to like conventional water filters and drew conclusions on if they were effective.
Right, so now let's just go through what we'll be explaining to you today. So first, we're going to go through what water filters are and how they work, and then we're going to describe to you our problem and our scientific method.
You probably know what water filters are, but do you know how they really work? If so, explain. You have water filters in your refrigerator, or maybe a water dispenser, or even a Brita. Water filters are a necessary to life, so what are they?
What is used as a conventional or typical water treatment was shared by the Safe Drinking Water Foundation. They stated that water treatment plants use a combination of coagulation, sedimentation, filtration, and disinfection to provide the public with safe drinking water. These techniques have been used and developed upon since the very early 20th century. The website further expands these topics by stating that coagulation is a process that involves adding iron or aluminum to water to neutralize the negative chemicals.
Do you mind repeating for that for us, River?
River, will you repeat that for us one more time? Sorry, you cut out.
Okay. So when salts and aluminums are added to the water, their chemicals neutralize the negative chemicals in the water, which are the things that aren't safe to be drinking. So salts like these are added, and when they're combined with the negative particles, they sink to the bottom, collect together in a process called sedimentation.
In a water treatment factory, the coagulant is added very quickly to the water, which allows the water to move on to the next step in the water filtration process. During filtration, any particles that are found in the water are then removed through a process that's made up of a bunch of pores in a variety of sizes. The holes in the purification are so small that not even a single grain of sand could pass through them. The filtration process removes bacteria or other things of that nature. And by using these water filters, water that once was unsafe and non-drinkable then becomes safe and is able to be drank in by many consumers. As Samco, an engineering company, states, raw water treatments can cost between $975,000 to up to $1.5 million, depending on a filter's flow rate and also water pressure. And altogether, water filters are complex and are critical to human life. And this is why we decided to run the experiments that we will be discussing today.
Okay, thank you for that, Ava. So as stated before, conventional water filters are currently very expensive and they aren't always accessible because of cost or location, despite the need for them. According to Our World in Data, according to Our World in Data, unsafe water leads to many illnesses and infectious diseases, including hepatitis A, polio, and typhoid. These diseases result in an estimated 1.2 million deaths in impoverished areas per year. The chart above shows countries' amounts of deaths from unsafe water in 2019. It can be seen that Africa as the continent had the most deaths, which is due to it being the poorest continent on Earth. The quality of water is currently very dependent on income. So as income increases, the quality of water does too. However, a large number of people living in sub-Saharan Africa live below the poverty line and they cannot afford safe drinking water.
So now as we looked into possible solutions to combat this issue, the idea of homemade water filters came to mind. Homemade water filters cost significantly less, and so therefore they would be more obtainable to say those who are in poverty areas. Now, if homemade water filters, say, do an equally good as job as conventional ones like a Brita, then more people would have access to safe and clean drinking water. This idea really made us question what it would be like to test homemade water filters when compared to conventional ones.
In our project, we started off by researching water how they work. Then we evaluate the problem of conventional water filters, which is better and not very accessible. Based on our
This table
after analyzing the results, we realized that there were many roadblocks to our experimental design, but we made conclusions based on how our experiment went overall.
This table shows the basic layout of our group's experimental design that was made before we even started experimenting. There were quite a few materials that we needed to gather prior to conducting our experiment. These materials included 3 tuna cans, coffee filters, activated carbon, sand, gravel, 2 plastic containers, a drill, lake water, rain and street water, containers for holding our purified water, and a microscope. We had a pretty lengthy procedure that involved collecting and gathering our materials, gathering the lake water and rainwater, and building the homemade filters. After we built the homemade filters, we tested the water and finalized by observing the purity of each water in a microscope. In our experiment, the independent variables were the water filters, while the dependent variable was the purity of the water. Additionally, the constants were the unfiltered lake and rainwater. Moving on, there were 3 groups in our project. The control group, which was the Brita filter, experimental group number 1, which was the bucket filter, and experimental group number 2, which was the tuna can filters.
All right, so according to the Environmental Protection Agency, water filters are responsible for removing the majority of contaminants from water. Although some contaminants may remain, they are still considered safe to drink if within EPA standards. However, people with weaker immune systems or are more vulnerable to disease are at a higher risk of getting sick from the remaining impurities.
Although conventional water filters use complex and reliable methods to purify water, homemade water filters can be of similar effectiveness. Healthline states that some of the best simple strategies to purify water is by both boiling and filtering water using activated carbon and charcoal. Boiling the water can help with preventing infectious diseases, and activated carbon is used to filter out toxic compounds, metals, germs, fluoride, or other materials that are not able to be consumed in large quantities. Our group decided to build 2 different filters that used multiple filtration strategies in order to find the best and safest outcome. Our hypothesis is that conventional water filters will typically work a little bit better than homemade water filters. However, we do theorize that homemade water filters can be of similar effectiveness while also making it significantly cheaper and more accessible to people that are located in lower income communities.
So for this experiment, we created 2 different homemade water filters, but our control group was actually the Brita filter. Now, the Brita, or the unfiltered water, passes through the top section of the Brita and it flows through a uniquely engineered aeration device as stated by Brita itself. The small mesh screens will then help filter out any debris and from the unfiltered water, and then the water will flow through a mix of purifying activated carbon and ion exchange resin, and as this will help remove any harmful odors or chemicals in the water. And both of our other filters did use activated carbon in them.
Our first filter, the bucket filter, consisted of 2 buckets. Inside the top bucket, there was a plastic cup filled with activated carbon and coffee filter. The contaminated water contained activated carbon in the bottom bucket full of the newly purified water. Our second design was somewhat similar to the bucket filter, and this design consisted of 3 tuna cans, each filled with a different purifying material, being gravel, sand, and activated carbon. Water passed through each stage and drained into a container. Each of these filters can be seen here, and the third image depicts the 3 purifying materials that were used in the tuna can filter.
These next images show the filtered water from each experimental group. We used water filter to purify both rain and lake water. These microscopic images give a detailed view of our findings of the experiment. Although we couldn't test the bacterial levels in the water or other precise measurements of purity, the images generally collect the clarity and purity of the water that we saw. We can infer that the homemade filters purified the water with similar effectiveness to the conventional Brita filters based on the images.
So for example, the image on the top right displays lake water that was filtered using the Brita. There are numerous visible contaminant particles in the water that reveal impurity. And while the rainwater was generally cleaner than that of the lake water, the bucket filter was found to be far more effective than the tuna can filter. Moreover, the rainwater filtered with the bucket filter had a visually equal quality of water to water filtered with the Brita, which can be seen in these microscopic images. Oh, I'm sorry, Ava, you're muted, sorry.
Next slide. Although our experiment was successful in teaching us more about our hypothesis and whether it was wrong or right, it did not come without a set of roadblocks. An immediate roadblock that we faced was with our first filter, which was the bucket filter. As stated before, the bucket filter consisted of 2 plastic buckets, a cup, activated carbon, and a single coffee filter. We took the cup and filled it with activated carbon and placed a single coffee filter on top. The coffee filter acted as a barrier to ensure that the activated carbon would not fall into our freshly purified water. However, the issue that we faced was that after too much water had passed through the coffee filter, it essentially disintegrated and tore, which caused the carbon particles to then fall into our water. And despite us trying to refilter the water to get the particles out, we were never able to entirely get the carbon out of the water. And so this unfortunately made it so that we weren't able to get the most accurate results.
Another major roadblock that we encountered was the weather. As seen previously, we tested rainwater that had run off into the street. We collected enough rainwater to fill a 32-ounce water bottle, although that was not nearly enough for our testing. If we had more water, then we may have seen more accurate results because we'd be able to complete a more in-depth comparison.
So now that we have tested the water filters, we question if these water filters are actually practical.
Kind of.
In reality, none of the water filters came without flaws, but it should be noted that one of our main goals with this experiment was to create a filtration system that could work for people in third world countries or who don't generally have access to purified water.
So as we found before, the activated carbon bucket worked exceptionally well. And so because of this, we would like to prompt you all with the ability to leave the speech with the ability to create a water filter on a hike, a camping trip, or even an emergency, because these water filters can prove to be very, very useful. We created a hypothesis that homemade water filters could be as effective as conventional ones.
This was done by researching different water filters like the tuna can water filter and by iterating them. They were tested along with a Brita filter using lake water and rainwater. And this helped us come to the conclusion that the bucket filter was the most effective and was even more reliable than the conventional Brita filter. Now, if you're ever stuck in a situation where you may need a homemade water filter, here up on the screen is a great website that can educate you further on how to make a homemade water filter.
Now, it might not be perfect, but it's better than without one.
And here are our references. Thank you for listening.